And we are beginning today to learn Masechta Chulin, which is a fascinating Masechta, and it's actually very relevant today's time. So the first few prakim discusses the concept of shchita and the laws of shchita, and then it moves on to treifus as well. So it's extremely important, I guess, for us to understand all of these rules. So just as a brief introduction, in shchita, we have what's the idea of shchita is two purposes. One is that it should be as painless as possible for the animal. Tzar Balachayim is an Isa Deraisa we had in the second paragraph of Metzir, and therefore we have to make sure it's as painless as possible. And as a result, we have a number of dinim, including the fact that the sakin, the chalav itself, has to be extremely sharp, with no pegimas, no flaws, so that it's very precise and instantaneous. The other reason the chinuch says, and I think he's the only one who says it, is that the reason why we have shchita is because it's very important that we extricate and we let all the blood escape from the animal. So therefore, this form of shchita, this is the way that the mass, I guess, the bulk of the blood escapes the animal, and then whatever remains, we salt and we extract the rest of the blood. And that's why the shchita is the format that it is. So as a result of that, we have a few psulim by shchita. For example, we have a psul of shehiyah. If you pause, and if you pause, it's a problem because then obviously it's more painful for the animal. There is a chakir from I think Chulin Daf is pausing a psul in shchita. Does that disqualify shchita, or is it because it's lacking in the shchita itself because you cannot combine the two parts of too long of a pause? How long the pause has to be, we'll see later in the Gemara, and that's called shehiyah. And then you have other psulim which we'll see later in the Gemara a little bit. But basically, another psul is if the knife, let's say, is wedged in between the two, you have to cut the two simonim, the trachea and the esophagus, or at least the rave of the two simonim. But if you wedge the knife between the two simonim and then you start cutting, that's called chaluda. The knife has to be revealed, has to be exposed. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I need a longer knife so that we can see the knife, even while you're shechting, we can see part of the knife. And then we have hagrama, which is if you shech, but the wrong part of the trachea, too low, too high. And we'll learn later about 5 different psulim in shchita. There is a big machlekes in the Rishonim as to whether there's a mitzvah called shchita. According to some Rishonim, there's a mitzvah say to shecht. According to other Rishonim, there's no such mitzvah as to shecht. The Rambam said the mitzvah shech. The Ravid says, and the Ramban and others, there's no such mitzvah shech. It's a lav. They say it's not a mitzvah say. It's a lav haba miklal say, which means there's a lav. If you eat from an animal that wasn't geshachted, you're over a shachted, you're over an avera, which emanates from the asay where the Torah says v'zavachta. The third opinion says there's actually no mitzvah or lav in shchita. You know why you need shchita? To remove the existing iser on a living animal. Every live animal, we are violating Eva Menachai if I eat from that animal. So by shechting, what we're doing is we are removing the iser of Eva Menachai. That's why we shecht. Or removing the iser of the Vema. There's a whole question, if you shecht an animal, it turns out to be treif. So how do we view that? Is it, this is Rab Chaim Brisker, is the pshat, the shchita was 100% valid, but a new iser kicked in called treif? Or is the pshat that since you shechted it turned out to be the animal's treif, then the shchita itself was never a proper shchita in the first place? And there's so many other questions which we'll discuss as we move on. So let's learn the first Mishnah. It says the Mishnah, Hakol shechtin. Everyone may shecht. When we say everyone, so the big machlekes Rishonim, the very first traces here says including women, that women may shecht if they want to, and it's not just b'di'evet, even lechatchila, women can shecht. In fact, Tesa says, why doesn't the Mishnah then spell out bein noshim, which we find many times? He says the only time the Mishnah would highlight the fact that noshim are included is if you would have thought they were not, and therefore the Mishnah says they are. But there's no reason to assume that women are not able to shecht, so why would the Mishnah have to highlight noshim and noshim? So and that's him. The Mordechai brings some others that disagree, And throughout Chulin as well, the Mordechai brings a sefer. Tosha brings the Hilchas Eretz Yisrael. There's another sefer written by a man which is very controversial called Eldad Hadoni. He claimed that he was from the Shevet of Dan, and the Mordechai quotes it a few times as a reference. So first the Mishnah says Hakol Shechtim, which sounds like Chatchila, you can go ahead and shecht. Then the Mishnah says Shchitas and Ksheira, which the Gemara will soon point out, which means that if they shechted, it's all right. So the Mishnah first clause is the Chatchila you can. The next clause is, as the Gemara will explain, that b'di'evet, it's valid. Third din, chutz mecheira shot v'katan. A cheira shot v'katan, somebody is deaf and dumb, somebody who is a shaita, a fool, or a child, a minor. None of those can shecht. Not only they cannot shecht with chatchila, they cannot even shecht b'di'evet. So like three different dinim here. And why is that? Shema yikalkul eschitasim. We are worried about the future. I mean, it's not only a problem right now. It's a problem that even let's say we found that they did the right thing, we shouldn't allow them to shecht because maybe in the future when they're not being monitored, they will ruin the shchita. Then the Mishnah concludes, the kulan and all of these. So we have the chatchila shechtin, b'di'eved, shchitas and ksheira, then chereshav and cotton shouldn't shecht at all, not the chatchila, not b'di'eved. But then the Mishnah concludes, the kulan and all of these. Now, who are all of these is a big question mark. Sheshachtu, they shechted. But v'achedim roinaisan, and others saw them shechting, and it was valid, shchitasan ksheira. So this is another category. What are we talking about over here? Are we talking about the cheresh sheitev and cotton? That even though we just said that the shchit is not valid, even with the evid, but if somebody was watching them, then it's all right. Or are we saying the kulan sounds like we're adding something, and there's another person besides the cheresh of the cotton that we don't really want them to shech, but if they did and others are watching, is good enough. So the Gemara will discuss all this. We're going to have like 5 different explanations how to understand the Mishnah. So let's talk the Gemara. So the Gemara, hakol shechtin l'chatchila, everyone can shecht, means l'chatchila from the outset they can shecht. Ushchitas and ksheira di'evet. And then it says the shchita is kosher, which sounds like it's only, if it happened, it's all right. The Avad. He says the Rav's son of Acha, who's a friend of Rashi. He says, I don't understand the Gemara's question. The Chol HaKoil L'Chatchila, who told you? No, you seem to ask as a contradiction in the Mishnah. First you start off saying that you're allowed to L'Chatchila, then you tell me it's only b'di'evet. What's going on here? So he asked Rav Ashi, who told you that Hakol means L'Chatchila? Maybe Hakol Shechta means that everyone, if they shechted, it's all right, b'di'evet. So, in fact, I'll prove it to you that Hakol does not mean that L'Chatchila. For example, there's a din called Tumura. So if I have an animal that I made, that I consecrated, I made it Hegdish, then I take another animal, according to Rashi, you bring it next to the first animal. It can't be somewhere else. Others say it could be somewhere else as well. I bring another animal over, and I say that this animal should be Tumura, should be in exchange for the original animal I made. The din is that you shouldn't do that. Lo yummy, you shouldn't do that. But nevertheless, if you did it, the din is if you did it, they're all both animals now. The first animal remains kodesh, and the second animal takes on the kedusha of the first animal as well. So it says over there, Hakoil mamidin. Everyone can make Tumura. And according to your understanding, Hakol means that L'Chatchila, everyone can do it. And yet, are you going to tell me that's Pshat? Does that mean L'Chatchila you can do it? It says clearly, Lo yachli fenu v'lo yomer. So you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't make the swap. I don't care if you're improving it or not improving it. You're not allowed to. So obviously, even though it says Hakol, it means b'di'evet. So why can't our Mishnah mean the same thing? What's the problem? So the Gemara, so Rabashi responds, what are you talking about Tumura? Tumura, the Mishnah itself, the one who said those words, Hakoil, explains itself. Hasam, there in the Mishnah, time it says, Lo yisha adam rashai, it says, not that the person actually is permitted to do Tumura, but what we mean is, if he did it, it's a valid Tumura. The Seifik Esra Abayim, but he will get 39 lashes. Or she will get 39 lashes. So that's the exception. But our Mishnah just says open-ended Hakol Shechten. It sounds like L'Chatchila, they can shecht. Ravacha doesn't stop. He said, well, let me ask you a question. I'll find you another Mishnah. You have a concept called Erkin, and you have a concept called the Meolai. Erkin is if I say the value, the set value that the Torah gave for that person or for myself, I'm going to donate to the Beis Hamikdash. That's Erkin. So the Torah gives you different, depends gender, what gender it is, and what age it is. The minimum has to be a month old, and then everyone has a set value. That's called an Erech. And then you have the Dava, which is, or Nidarim, which is, I say, the true value on the slave market, I will donate. And there's no minimum. It could be a day old, and it still has a value. Now, so the Mishnah there says, Hakol ma'arichin, everyone can be ma'arich, and we learn out over there, everyone means even a child who's under bar mitzvah, if they're 12 years old and they understand what they're doing, it's effective, this promise that they said. And the Nerochin, everyone obviously has a value set in the Torah as long as they're more than a month old, and it doesn't matter which gender you are. And the same thing we say about yourself, because somebody else makes a difference. Noidrin v'nidarin, everyone can say my true value or that person's true value, even less than a month old. Hakol nidarim, every person has a value. Is hachinam l'chatchila. So you can tell me hakol sounds like, yeah, go ahead, l'chatchila, it's a good idea. But the haksiv, it's written in the pasuk, we read this in other Gemaras. There's an argument in Rameh Rabbi Yehuda if it's a good idea to make vows, even though you're doing it for a noble cause, right? You're going to give money to the Beis Hamikdash. So Rameh says, in one pasuk it says in the V'chi Sechdal Lindor, if you are going to avoid making the darim, lo yibachachet, be a good thing because then you won't sin, because you won't breach your neder. And then he says in Kehelis, even in Kehelis, Toiv asher loy tider, it is better not to make a vow, misha tider v'loy than making a vow and not paying up. What about making a vow and paying up? So Rameir says, Vitanya, and Rameir says, Toiv mizeh, but the best is, she'einu noyder kolika. He says, the best is that you don't make a neder at all. Best thing is because then you don't put yourself in that in a situation that you might forget or you might breach a net. So the mayor holds, don't make any nedarim. So when this mission says hakol ma'arichim and narachi, that you can go ahead and give make these promises, not according to Rameir, he says don't do it. Rabbi Yehuda, he totally discourages it. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda says toy mizeh. No, the pasuk says it's better that if you don't make a promise and not keep it. But if you make a promise and keep it, that's best. Toiv mizeh umizeh. The best thing is noidir umisham. You make a promise and you keep it. And Nochmer, afilu Rabbi Yehuda, even Rabbi Yehuda, who encourages one to make a neder, is like Ka'amar. You know when he says that? You say harezu. If you say this animal will be kodesh, Rabbi Yehuda says then you can't do anything wrong. If the animal dies, you're exempt or you're from perceiving the neder because he said harezu. This particular animal is consecrated, but it no longer is in existence. So, but if you say Aval Oma Harelai, even Rabbi Yehuda will concede that's dangerous because if the animal dies, it becomes difficult. You took it upon yourself. You always have this neder that you have to abide by, and that makes it difficult. So Rabbi Yehuda also thinks it's not a good idea. So no one thinks it's a good idea, and yet it says Hakol Marichin, which sounds like Chatchil. You can do that. Traces already asks, and all the Rishonim ask. So what's this whole idea of ever making a neder? People donate karbonis, and you say Harei Elai. It sounds like Mari here that no one, not Rabbi Meir and not Rabbi Yehuda, think it's a good idea. So the whole idea of shlamim and all these karbonis, you're discouraging it. So what's going to happen? You're saying that don't do it. So Teresa says, and others are trying to say, we're talking about making an edestam. You decided, you want to donate a carbon, but if you're doing it because you went through a tzara, if you're doing it because something happened, and you feel obliged to bring a carbon, whatever the carbon is, or to do some kind of mitzvah, then for sure it's a good idea. We had in the Dor of Ches that it's a good idea. That you do a mitzvah, that you make a shvur, that you're going to learn you're going to learn Torah, you do mitzvahs. It's a good thing if you feel that you need it.
Why wouldn't a person just bring the carbon without making the neder?
Because ask a better question. Why B'chlal have the whole concept of the Dorim? The Torah said Midvar Shekatirchak. So the moment I said I'll do something, I have to do it anyway. What's the idea of a neder and a shvur? Anyway, what's the purpose? The Gemara says in Gittin that there was a mountain, that there was a mountain, Tur Yanai, that was destroyed during the Churban Sheni because the people there made Nedarim. But actually, the people ate this part. The people ate Nedarim. Sorry, people made Nedarim that can eat meat, and they kept the neder. So everybody asked, so what's the problem? So what's the problem? If you made a neder and you kept it, big deal, and they should get destroyed. So it's not like this. The idea of a neder over midvar sheker, if you make you say, I'm going to do this. Give me my word is my bond, right? So what do you need more than that? The din is that if, let's say, things go wrong, and suddenly, it's a struggle, then if you don't do it, you didn't breach your word. It's not a question of nothing happened. But when you make a neder, what you're doing is you are harnessing all of your entire being, and you're saying, I'm committing myself. I am going to do this regardless of what happens. That's what a neder is all about. And therefore, if you're doing a mitzvah, why are you making a neder to do a mitzvah? To make sure you actually do it. And to make sure that even if there might be some obstacles and challenges, I'm still going to overcome them, and I'm going to do this mitzvah. That's why to keep your words and talking about learning Torah is a good thing, because you know that you don't have that willpower, but if every time you remember you made a neder, you'll do it. As far as your word, okay, it became difficult, then you can walk away. And worse than that, in Masechta Kala, it says that the argument Besham Basil, if Ketzir Menaktin Lifnei HaKala, how do you dance before Kala? And Beshamai said, Hill says, Kala no Chasuda, how beautiful she is, and Beshamai says, Kala Kamoshihi, you just tell her the truth. If she's pretty, you tell her she's pretty. If she's ugly, you tell her she's ugly. And Shammai's argument to Hill is Midvasha Ketircha. What is singing the song Kala Chasidim Midvasha Ketircha? And Basil answers back, it's not now Gemara Ksubas of Yitches, of Yizayin, but it's in Masechta Kala. And Hill answers back, the Isser of Midvasha Ketircha is only in a court case. The Naki Vitzar Yadag, it is talking in a courtroom in front of a judge, you're not permitted to lie. But there's no Isser to lie. Stop. So a word doesn't have that kind of power as an editor. That's why you do it. Okay, let's continue. So he says here, so therefore he's saying, as we see, that the words hakoil doesn't necessarily mean lechatchila. Doesn't mean lechatchila. So then he goes back, yeah. So the Gemara is saying, okay, so sometimes it doesn't mean lechatchila. But in our Mishnah, does it mean lechatchila or doesn't mean lechatchila? What does it mean? And he continues. He says, okay, we have a few exceptions, but generally, ela hakol chayavim b'sukkah, hakol chayavim b'tzitzis, hochinami d'lav lechatchila. So Rav Ashi says back to Rav Chia bar Rava, but in most places, when it says hakol, it means lechatchila. You can do it. For example, everyone is chayav b'tzitzis, everyone is chayav sukkah. It means lechatchila, you got to sit in the sukkah. Lechatchila, you got to wear tzitzis. So Rav Chia answers back, like chayavin, I'm not talking about where it says chayavin. Obviously, then you have to do it. So Rav Ashi says back, okay, so you're telling me that that the word hakel doesn't mean lechatchila unless it says chayavin. So that's a question. It says hakel soimchin, everyone does smicha. Echad hanashim, whether you're a man, echad nashim, whether you're a woman. Hachi nami de lav lechatchila, and doesn't say the word chayavin, and you don't think it means lechatchila that you have to give smicha. But see, it says v'samach yadik. It says a pasuk clearly you have to put smicha on all these kabbanas yachid. You have to do smicha. The exception was we had tchoir and meiser and psachim that you don't do smicha, but all other kabbanas we had in tzvachim, we had menachas and end of menachas that you have to do smicha. So okay, some of the other minutes. So it says clearly here that you have to give smicha. By the way, all the Mefarshim are grappling with this brisa because they can't find it. Because it says over here, men are chayim smicha and women, and we know clearly that women are not chayim smicha. Just a question if they did it, if they can they. But there's no such thing as a woman chayim smicha. So where this brisa is, nobody can find it. says the Gemara. Yes. So Rav Chia says, Ika hakel lechatchila. The Ika hakel there, but sometimes hakel means lechatchila, like over here by smicha, and sometimes it means b'diavad. But the question here is, el hakel dehocha. But why are you asking me a question here? Why are we discussing what in our Mishnah is a contradiction? Hakoil means lechatchila, and then who told you what the word hakoil in our Mishnah means lechatchila? Who told lechatchila? Teacher, you ask me. Deal with the evidu. Maybe it's only b'di'evid. And you have no question. So the Mishnah reads hakoil sheichtin b'shchitazim sheida means b'di'evid. Oh Malay. So Rav Ashi said, "Ano I shchitos and ksheda kashli." When I asked my question, he misunderstood. My question was that the word shchitos and ksheda clearly means b'di'evid. If hakol sheichtin also means b'di'evid, that if they did it's all right, then why repeat hakol sheichtin u'shchitos and ksheda? Obviously, hakol sheichtin means that it's kosher shchita, and you tell me b'di'evid. The fact that you tell me hakol sheichtin, then you say shchitos and ksheda means shchitos and ksheda is a case of b'di'evid, and hakol sheichtin is a case of chatchila. And that's what I'm asking. What's going on here? Is it lechatchila or is it b'di'evid? B'diktoni shchitos and ksheda di'evid miklal the hakol lechatchilu. Because if you can tell me the evid, if you can tell me the hakol also means that if it happened, it's all right. Then touch the evid lam. They want to the evid for. So now the Gemara will give us 5 different answers of how to understand our Mishnah. But a very important places here. It's important places because you have these new modern day Bible critics and Gemara critics and everything else. So we had about 30 years ago a whole group of professors from Bar Ilan University, Talmud critics, came here and gave us a lecture in the yeshiva. And basically their theory is hopefully they no longer have that theory, but the theory was that majority of the Gemara was not written by Amoraim. Only time that the Gemara is Amoraim is if it says Omar Rava, Omar Rabbi, you have a name of authority, and that's what they said. But whenever there's a discussion in the Gemara, it's not them. It was written many years later by Rabbanan Svroi, the Goinim. It's not part of the Gemara. And they had all these different color sheets where they were overlaying one on top of another to show when these things were written. And then they explained that the Rambam was the only one who understood that. Rashi didn't, Chas v'sholom, but Rashi didn't, only the Rambam didn't. That's why you find sometimes the Rambam paskins are different than our Gemara, and everybody's pulling their hair out. Why does the Rambam paskin when our Gemara clearly says opposite? So they said because the Rambam understood how to learn a piece of Gemara and no one else did. It was an awful shir, I'm sorry to say. So I wanted to learn with you a taste.
Why did they let these guys in?
They're all from. But I will just read you a taste of it. So I actually stood up there and I told them that Rashi in Bab Metzia says clearly that Rav Ashi and Ravina wrote the entire Gemara. And they said that proves our point, that Rashi didn't understand the Gemara, how Gemara worked. It was terrible. But look at the Taisus here, because all the Rishonim on this Taisus say the same thing. The Taisus, it's an important Taisus to remember, so I think we should learn it inside, so you should remember it. Taisus, the second Taisus on the page, base on base. Anosh chitos ksheda kokashali. I meant to ask the following way. Now, the Gemara started off, no name. It was like a regular Gemara. Like every Gemara we learn, no question and answer, question, a debate, but no names, which they say was Rabbanan Svroi. Suddenly, Rav Chia was asking all these questions, and then Rav Ashi finally said, when I originally asked the question, this is what I meant. I meant to ask, this redundant, if they both mean b'di'evid. So Taisus says, Anosh chitos ksheda kokashli, says Taisus, Mashma, it seems, Rav Ashi hiksha oisa kusha. Now it becomes clear that initially when the Gemara started the discussion, it was Rav Ashi who was initiating that discussion, even though his name wasn't there. The Afa Pishi, his Sugas Gemara, it was an anonymous Sugya, no names. And yet suddenly now we discovered that this Gemara was written and said by Rav Ashi, says Taisus. Umikan, says that from here, remember, Raya, this proves, Rav Ashi Sidir HaGemara. Rav Ashi wrote the entire Gemara. Every discussion we have in the Gemara was written by Rav Ashi. Even though we find, this discussion here involves the Abai and Rava, we'll see. The Hen Kodmor Habla Rav Ashi, they lived prior to Rav Ashi. Shema Gambi Mehem Hikshukra. They also asked the question then, but Rav Ashi is the one who recorded it. So Teza, this is the Gemara right here to prove Rav Ashi wrote the whole Shas and not anyone after him. Okay, let's continue.
What happened to Ravina?
When we say Rav Ashi and Ravina and Mazutra, they were all involved, and his colleagues, but that generation, they studied it, and Rav Ashi then wrote it down. Okay, let's continue. So what's Pshat in our Mishnah? So here we're going to have a number of Pshatim, and the Gemara is going to keep on repeating half of the Pshat. So when you learn in the next page and a half, you can go through quickly. So I think about the first answer. Amar Rabbi Abullah says, Hachik Tani, This is how you should learn the Mishnah. Hakol shoichin is lechatchila. What are we talking about over here? Okay, so briefly, chulin becomes tameh is no problem at all. As long as you're not a kohen that you have to worry about your tumah, anybody can eat it. But then there were people who took upon themselves chulin to eat it al taharas hakodesh. They took it upon themselves to eat chulin and treat it like hekdesh. And we had Gemara Chagiga in the third Pedic. How far do we take that? So there's a machlekes. If it takes on all the dinim of hekdesh, and just like you're not allowed to contaminate hekdesh, nor can you contaminate what do you call it? Chulin shenasa taharas hakodesh, or we say there's no such thing. And then you have hegdish. The Torah says mishmeres mishmarti. You have to guard the hegdish. You need to make sure that the hegdish, truma, and all that does not become tameh. So we're going to learn that 3 stages. There could have 3 different cases. One case would be ordinary chulin, a tameh person shechting, ordinary chulin, which we're going to say l'chatchila, no problem. Then you have a tameh person shechting al taharas hakodesh. I mean, there's no chiddush tell me a tamik and shech chulin. So it means when we say the chatchila, we're talking about even if it's chulin shenasa al taras hakodesh, a tamik can shecht it. Why can a tamik shecht it? Because it's not really touching the animal, and he'll be careful. So therefore, the chatchila you can shecht, and then you have hegdish. The real hegdish, the chatchila, we don't want a tamik to shecht real hegdish because he might touch the animal or the meat of the animal itself. After all he's doing is holding the knife. There's no problem. We'll ask the knife itself transfers the tumah. We'll soon see. But in that case, we don't want it to happen. But the other, if it happened, it's all right. Okay, so let's go to the Gemara inside. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabba. Amar Rabba said, how you learn it? Everyone shechta, feel tameh b'chulin, even a tameh b'chulin. Says the Gemara, if you need a Mishnah to tell you that, tameh b'chulin, ma'ila memra, what's the chiddush? So Gemara says, you're right. The first clause in the Mishnah is b'chulin shenas al taras hakodesh, chulin that was done al taras hakodesh. And you would have thought, if it's done al taras hakodesh, then you have to treat it like hegdish. Well, kasava chulin not taras hakodesh, get kodesh done, makes it treat like hegdish, and therefore, just like hegdish, you have to be careful and guard it and make sure it doesn't go tummy. Same thing here. Is Kate otherwise? So you now just go ahead and make it tummy. Maybe sakana rucha, you bring a long knife, v'shoichet bar, you shecht. You shouldn't touch the flesh. Now we're talking about, I've seen the bottom of the page, we're talking about somebody who touched a mace. So this person is tummy mace. And there's a big problem, because if you tummy mace, you're not allowed to enter the Azora. You shecht an animal inside the Beis HaMikdash. The Ezras Noshim was 135 amos long. You're not allowed to be there, so you were outside. You needed to have a knife that was 135 amos long. How was that possible? Or longer than that, 136 amos long. How is that possible? It's very, very difficult to understand the practical terms. So one of the answers given is, according to Rabbeinu Tam, a tamei mace is not permitted to enter the Ezras Nashim, but if he was there and became tamei mace inside the Ezras Nashim, he doesn't have to leave. And that's the case we're talking about over here. Okay. Other Shem say he shouldn't have gone there, but he went. And we're not discussing the person, we're discussing the animal. Says the Gemara further, so Kadesh a long knife, you shouldn't touch the flesh. So that we say lechatchila, you can go ahead and shech. We're not worried if it's chulin shenas al taras hakodesh. But if it's hegdish and shech, shema yigiv basar, that you might touch the basar. And but in order for food to become tameh, it has to be prepared and get wet. Muchla kabel tumah. So it's the blood. Even though the blood of the animal is not metameh because it's very thick. In this case here, we say chibas kodesh. The fact that it's so choshev that it's chibas hegdish, it becomes tameh as well. And he says, and apart from that, the first one, the Rishonim want to know, the animal is still jumping around, it's still considered technically alive as far as tumah is concerned. So even if he touched it while he was shechting with a knife, and he touched the animal, who cares? The animal is still alive. So Tay says, must be talking about the animal stopped jumping around. Now, if he did shech, but he have it, and he says, but I know for a fact, I didn't touch, then shchita, it's a valid shchita. Then the Mishnah says, "Chutz mechedesh sheite v'cotton," except for a chedesh and a sheite and a cotton. That what I feel b'chulin greda, even ordinary chulin the evid namla. We don't want them shechting. Why? Because we are worried they are going to make a treif. Shema yishu, maybe they will pause in their shchita. Shema yidusu, maybe they will press. You have to cut because we want to quick in and out. And the animal then dies practically instantaneously. But if you're going to press, then it's very painful, and we don't want that to happen. And Vishema Yachlidu, you wedge the knife in between the trachea and the esophagus, and the knife has to be exposed. We're going to do the wrong thing. But then it says the Kulan Shashachtim. They all shechted high. What case are we talking about here? Elaim, are referring back to the Cheshev the Cotton, that if they did it, as long as people observed what they were doing is good enough. Allah Koi, we're talking about them. So why does it say the Kulan? Should have just said the Im Shachtim, if they didn't heed our instructions and they just proceeded with the Shchita, and you should have said that and say it's good enough. Ella, we're referring back to Tomei Bechulin. We're talking about that a Tomei. A Tomei person touch Shecht and Chulin, it's all right. He said before you keshecht. The Ella, we're talking about a Tomei b'migdoshim. The case of that only b'di'evet. If somebody was Tomei and he did Chulin shenasa tarza kodesh. So we just learned before that if he says, I know for a fact I didn't touch, it's good enough. Says the Gemara, talking about a case with the lesser kamon than the shaili. He's not around to ask. If he's not around to ask, what do we do now? We don't know whether he touched the animal, didn't, can we eat it, cannot, is a shchita or not. So therefore we say that if there were people observing and they said he did, it's all right. Okay, so that's tastes and all the shayim want to know. We have a general rule that a suffix tumah, if you don't know if something is tumah not, if it's in a public domain, we're always makel. We learn from Saita that's only in the private domain that we are machmir, but not in the public domain. So l'chayre, when the Beis Hamikdash is a public domain, you don't know whether he touched the animal or he didn't touch the animal. It's a suffix. So the suffix is Torah. What do you have to ask anybody for? What do you need other people for? Why do you even have to ask in the first place? So Taisa answers, we only say that one of the answers. We only say that when the suffix is pretty 50-50, so we say, you know what, in suffix Tumish Rabim, we are lenient. But over here, the chances of him touching the animal while we're shechting is much higher than 50-50, and therefore we need to ask. Then the word continues. Hi, Tomei, so you're telling me, according to Rabbi Barula, we learned that Tomei, by Kochim, we learned what? A Tomei, a person should not go ahead and touch Chul Shnas Atarza Kodesh. And real Kochim, that's right. Chul Shnas Atarza Kodesh, he can lechatchila. And real Kochim lechatchila, you shouldn't only be the Eved. Why does the Mishnah have to mention that? We know from another place, Mahasa Nafka, we learned it already elsewhere. We learned where it says, Kol hapsulim sheshachtu shchitasin ksheira. Anybody that's disqualified, if the pearl they shechted, the shchita is kosher. Shashchita ksheira, because you're allowed to shech bizarre. You don't need a kohen. So if a kohen pasal shechta, who cares? You're allowed to shech Yisrael, benoshim, women, ubavodim, ubetmeim, people who are tummy. It's clear that even Thomas tummy can shech a carbon. But if you look at the kachim. Well, as long as they be careful not to touch the flesh. So we know from there already that a tummy can be the evid shech to the kachim is good enough. What do you Mishnah for? Gemara gives two answers. Either here's the main din, because we're talking about shechting, and hasam aidi the tana sharpsul, and there it talks about other people that are apostle. Tana nami tamei migdash. So also it throws in that a tamei, as long as the shchita it's all right, but migdash it's all right. Or hasamik, the main gemara is over there because it talks about kachim. But here, once we're talking about by a chulin to a person, what's it in? So we have to throw in kachim. Says the Gemara, let me ask a practical question. This person is holding a knife. Now, the din is that a corpse is an avi avoisa tumah. If a person, that's the grandfather of tumah, if a person touches it, they're an ava tumah. And then if they touch anything, it becomes tameh, kalim, food and drink, because they become a rishon. But if you touch a sheretz is merely an ava tumah. So if someone touches the sheretz, they become a rishon tumah. If they touch kalim, it does not become tameh. They touch another person, they don't become tameh. The only thing they can be tameh is food and drink, rishon and sheni. So the question here is, how did this person become tameh? Says the one of this. I don't know what's going on here. Hi tameh. No, but we're going to ask a question. Even if he personally didn't touch the animal, but the knife did. And we know there's a special din. We learn out that a knife is different than all other kalim, that if it touches the corpse, it takes on the level of tumah of the corpse. If it touches the person who touched the corpse, it takes on that level. So if the person is an ava tumah, because he touched the corpse, he's holding on to a knife, the knife itself is an ava tumah. So therefore, if it touches the meat, it becomes tameh. It becomes tameh. So had the knife become, if this wouldn't have been this din, and the knife only becomes a rishon, maybe. But here we're talking about the knife or let's say the knife is a sheni, doesn't go any further. But here the knife takes on the same level of tumah as the person. No, it's an avatuma. So who cares if the person touched the animal? Didn't the knife touch the animal? Ask the Gemara. Hi, what are we talking about here? We're talking about he touched the corpse. We learn out that the halal cherev, that there's a sword on the deceased. Cherev hareyu kechol. We learn out that the knife has the same thing as the chol. Avatumu, it has the same status as the person. It's an avatumu. Letame lesakin. So therefore, the knife itself is an avatumu. Then also sakin with tumas lebasa. And then the sack goes along and touches the meat and becomes a rishon. Ella, when answered the itma b'sheret. So we're talking about that the person touched the sheret. So he is a rishon. And in the case of a sheret, we don't say that the knife takes on the same level of tumah that it touches. Only in the case of this, if the tumah originated from a corpse. So if the person is a rishon, the knife becomes a sheni, and a sheni cannot pass on the tumah. So therefore, and therefore doesn't become, the knife does not pass on to the tumah to the schul shnasa tarzah kodesh. That's one answer. Touch a sheret. The other one is the boy saying, we're talking about that he touched a mess. Ukegoyin, and for example, he didn't use a knife. Shebodak krumis shokana. He used the one side of a reed, which was very, very sharp, but it's like a wooden thing, and wood is a clay wood. If it's a flat keli, does not become tumah, does not generate tumah. The shachaba, and that's what he shechted the animal with. That's why the tumah didn't pass. The time we learned. You can shecht using any Torah. Nowhere does the Torah say what kind of instrument you should use to shecht. So you can use anything as long as it's chopped. Bein b'tzur, whether it's a stone. Bein b'chuchis, whether it's a piece of glass. Bein b'krumish l'kana, whether it's a krumish l'kana. So that's what they used it, and that's why the tumah didn't pass on. So that's the first answer to the Gemara. Tomorrow you'll learn another 4 answers to the Gemara. But basically other 5 answers to the Gemara. So it's a total of 6. So then basically what the answer here is, when it says Hakol Shechti, we're talking about Shechting Chulin Shanasa Tarsa Kodesh, and this person was Tamei L'Chatchila Shecht, as long as he says he didn't touch the meat. And what do you call it? But when it comes to Kachin L'Chatchila Tamei Shecht, only B'diev, if he did, it's all right as long as he said he didn't touch the meat. In the first case, it doesn't even have to say he didn't touch the meat. We assume that he didn't. And a Chershav Katan can't do it, and even B'diev, but if somebody watching over them, then it's all right, including if a Tamei shechted hegdish and he's not around to ask, but somebody observed and said he did all right, then didn't touch the animal, it's all right. Have a good walk, everybody.
Can I ask a question?